Happy Sunday, everybody. We come to the end of the first week of Aetherdrift. I'm sure lots of you are anticipating seeing the Pro Tour results as much as I am. We should be talking about those tomorrow during my Best of 1, Best of 3 meta review. So, what I like to do on Sundays, though, is go over the week's meta breakers, if you will. And so they're all decks that were successfully piloted to Mythic with at least a 60% win rate and at least 50 matches. And I try to keep them separate from the ones that I talk about in the Best of 1, Best of 3 meta review. Now, one of the problems that I'm having right now is that there's so much diversity in Best of 1 that there's like 20 tier 2 decks that are all viable to take to Mythic. And so like Mono Black Midrange is a very popular deck and is largely considered part of the meta, but last week wasn't included in the Best of 1, Best of 3 meta review. Just didn't make it into the top 8 because it has some bad matchups against like Azorius Omniscience, Azorius Oculus, things like that. So, but what I want to do is talk about just kind of what this pilot did, kind of give them a shout out as just a fun little thing that we do on Sundays. So this was Mono Black Midrange by Shakua, went 94 and 58 for a 62% win rate. And as far as like the variations that are different in this deck than what we typically see, we see that the Soulstone Sanctuaries are being run instead of the Mishra's Foundry. We see that there's no Sheoldred's Edict in this list, as well as Nowhere to Run. Nowhere to Run being a very popular option to answer the Sheltered by Ghosts. This one's also not running any Liliana of the Veil. Instead, though, we see an additional copy of the Archfiend of the Dross. Usually this is at 2. Sometimes it goes all the way up to 4. Kind of just depends. It's worse against the like removal, like Go for the Throat, but better against red, where you can get outside of the Witchstalker Frenzy. And then we also have Anoint with Affliction, 2 additional copies of Anoint with Affliction. So usually we see 2 of these and then 2 of like Nowhere to Runs or something. And this one's playing a full playset. Obviously, this is better against things that are problematic things that are value 3 or less, right? They're like the Mosswood Dread Knights and Golgari, which you see more in Best of 3 than you see in Best of 1. I don't know, get rid of a Screaming Nemesis, that sort of thing, right? And then we also see Cruel Claw's Heist. And so this one is leaning a little bit more into the direct hand hate instead of letting them choose off of Liliana, using Cruel Claw's Heist to then reveal their hand and choose a non-land card from it. So. Next up is Selesnya Rabbits. Selesnya Rabbits didn't actually make it into my top 8 on the Best of 1, Best of 3 meta review. Despite it being a very good deck and performing better in high ranking or performing better in Mythic than it does in Platinum, right? And part of that is because in Platinum and lower, you're going to end up against a lot more mono red, and this deck can struggle against the mono red build. So again, we're just gonna. So this one was Selesnya Rabbits by Zyrain, went 80 and 53 for a 60% win rate into Mythic, and as far as the changes that we, compared to what we usually see in Selesnya Rabbits, we can see that they've dropped 3 copies of the Oak Hollow Village. This is usually run as a full playset because on 5 mana you can give all of your 1/1 bunnies off of Hop to it the +1/+1 counters. So yeah, the downside with that is being able to not cast. You can only spend the green mana to cast a creature spell, which there isn't any green spells in this, so I don't find the Oak Hollow Villages to be too awkward in this deck, honestly. But we also see that they dropped 1 Knight Errant of Eos. This is usually played as a full playset. And then we also see that they dropped the 4 copies of the Seasoned Wearing Guard, which is just the little 1-drop rabbit that gets +2/+0 if you have a token, and instead is bringing in the Sheltered by Ghosts. And this helps out against the mono red matchups, so the life gain can really help. You want to make sure to put it on something though that's going to continue to grow, so your Valley Might Caller into Sheltered by Ghosts is one of the better lines. You can also put it on a Burrow Guard Mentor, right? Just something that's going to be not stuck as like a smaller creature that they can then block. And then you're also looking at, let's see, they ran 1 additional Phineas. Sometimes we see like a 2-3 split. This one's running a 3-3 split and then dropping 1 Knight Errant of Eos, like I mentioned. And then the lands got a little bit of a tweak, like we're running the Hushwood Verge and the Thran Portal instead of cards like the Brushland and the Razor Verge Thicket, which they still have 3 copies of, but you can run those up to 4. So, all right, and this isn't in any particular order. This is just how I picked them out throughout the weeks. So this was Gruul Aggro by Anthroglade, went 33 and 17, and for a 66% win rate, smack dab on the 50 matches. And this one is more towards the build that we're seeing quite popular pick in the Pro Tour. So we'll be talking about this one tomorrow in the best of 3 section. Kind of being called the Gruul Mice build because you do have the Heartfire Hero, Manifold Mouse, Emberheart Challenger. Back in the previous set in Foundations, I would say that the Gruul Aggro archetype was the more popular build was running Slickshot Show-Off and going for more of a prowess build, so including things like Might of the Meek, Shocks, Monastery Swift Spears, the Slickshot Show-Offs, all of which benefit off of the cheap spells that you can cast in this archetype. And then was running 1 additional Snakeskin Veil, and I think Snakeskin Veil is more important if you are going to go for the kind of prowess build with the Slickshot Show-Off. So this one's bringing in the Pop Hatch Recruit, which is a very popular pick at the end of Foundations, and bringing in the 4 copies of the Hired Claw, which we've seen actually in Mono Red some people dropping the Hired Claw, so keep that in mind. And then also running the 4 copies of the Screaming Nemesis, right? And so I think this build is becoming the more popular build, when we'll see as we get more data on Aetherdrift. So this one's also running 4 copies of Innkeeper's Talent. Some run 2, 3, 4, it kind of varies. And then Burst Lightning as well as Torch the Tower. We see sometimes like a 3-3 split. This one's running a 2-2 split. And then bringing in some more mountains than we see in the Prowess build. And then next up here is Boros Convoke by Yari Yari. Went 113 and 70 for a 62% win rate. And this one doesn't have a lot of the new cards from Aetherdrift, so we do have the Sunbillow Verge as well as the Nesting Bot. But I've seen a couple of other cards from Aetherdrift being explored in this archetype, so I just want to kind of give them a shout out. One is the Voyager Glide Car. That's the 1 mana vehicle in white that can tap additional creatures to get the +1/+1 counter and flying for a turn. Hazaret, Godseeker, the 1 in a red God in red, has been explored in this as well, that can give a creature with power 2 or less unblockable. And then this list is not running the Sheltered by Ghosts. And so sometimes we do see a full play set, usually 2, I think nowadays, for against the mono red matchup, which can again be kind of difficult for this one. This one's better at punishing the mono black builds because of going wide. And then we also see the Sanguine Evangelist has been kind of dropped. This is one that's usually included in this archetype in the kind of older builds. And then we have 3 copies of Arabella, which is sometimes we see like one of this. So this is leaning the most heavily into the Arabella, and it's kind of an answer to not having the Sheltered by Ghosts because it gives you the life gain to then help against the race against mono red. And then we have 2 copies of Lorn of the Third Path. Usually you see this more as a best of 3 sideboard card. But it does work well against the, Urbrask's Forge, other Sheltered by Ghosts, Storm Chaser's Talent, Nowhere to Run, in Dimir Bounce and Esper Bounce. And then we also have 1 Manland, which sometimes is included. I would say, again, this is a more common inclusion in best of 3 than what I see in best of 1. And much to my surprise, Mono Red Goblins didn't make it into the top 8 in the first Mono Red. So we're going to get into week 2, right? This is the end of week 1. There's got to be some sort of transition, right? So in the previous week, in the very first week, maybe there was just too much exploration with all of the goblin options that we have that we didn't see it. I expect to see it tomorrow. We'll see. But so this week we've got 2 mono red goblin builds that I want to talk about. So the first one is Mono Red Goblins by Oscar, went 57 and 35 for a 62% win rate. And this one is leaning away from Krenko. So the more popular build in Aetherdrift that I've seen is kind of taking advantage of the haste off of the Howl Squad Heavy, which then can allow you to bring in Krenko and immediately tap it. Now, in the past, we did see Krenko builds in Foundations that were built off of Agatha's Soul Cauldron. And so the most popular version in Aetherdrift that hopefully we'll talk about tomorrow is not running the Agatha's Soul Cauldron, but is instead leaning into impact trimmers and yeah, giving your Krenko haste. So it's also running things like the Grease Wrench Goblin from Aetherdrift, as well as 2 additional copies of the Amonkhet Raceway, and yeah, so this one's going in a little bit of a more Lord-centric build, so we do have the Dropkick Bombers, which I've seen being dropped for the kind of more go-wide build, and so this one's going taller with the Lords, if you will. Running an additional copy of the Cavern of Souls, and running the 3 copies of the Lifecraft engine. And this is what I mean by leaning more heavily into the Lord build, is not only do you have the Dropkick Bomber, but you also have the Lifecraft engine on top of the Rundville Horde Master, right? So this build having 11 Lords for your Goblins. And we've also got the some sweepers, though, too, which don't usually see this. Usually you're just trying to overwhelm the board with Goblins, and if you fall behind, you fall behind. So this one I thought was kind of an interesting one to see. But because there's more artifacts specifically in Aetherdrift, the second one, destroy all artifacts with mana value 3 or less, could be an interesting one to have against certain builds like the Azorius Oculus, or the Azorius Affinity deck. That's like, if you call Azorius Artifacts the one that's doing the Simulacrum Synthesizer, the Affinity one's more like the Leyline Axe and the Mendicant, or whatever it's called, that gets power equal to all of the artifacts. So, kind of an interesting inclusion. This one's also keeping the 4 copies of the Cacophony Scamp. Again, the more popular build is dropping the Cacophony Scamps with more of a go-wide strategy. Since this is leaning more heavily into the 11 Lords, I like having the Cacophony Scamp. In my version that was running in Foundations, I was running the Cacophony Scamps. And then we have Soulstone Sanctuary, which can be, works with the Goblins, especially with the Lords. And then running the 2 copies of the Ghost Vacuum is another one that usually we're just trying to get the engine to work as best as possible. So if you come up against like the Azorius Omniscience deck, you just kind of accept that this has very little interaction. So personally, I would be on a more linear strategy where you're not trying to disrupt your opponent's plays. But again, this is not my deck. So this being in here for artifact hate, or sorry, graveyard hate. And we saw some really cool archetypes come out in the Pro Tour, like the Jeskai Oculus build, the Jeskai Monument build, which are a little bit different from one another. One focusing more on Oculus and getting it out of the graveyard, while the other one is focusing more on discard effects off of like Inti and things like that. So we'll see if that also filters in. I noticed that the Jeskai Oculus build made it into the top 8, so we'll be talking about that tomorrow, but the Jeskai Monument build did not. Right? So some archetypes are going to be left behind, sadly. Of course, if you want to talk to me about them, feel free to reach out in my Discord or in the comments. Love talking about Magic the Gathering, which is why I do this. So Orzhov Pixie is kind of like the Esper bounce deck, but is ditching blue so that we can play some of the double pip cards that are harder to justify in a 3-color archetype. So the real benefits for this one is Braids. We've seen actually the Orzhov Pixie build like long ago, right? When we got this in Outlaws of Thunder Junction, Cabeza de la Bolo was doing some very interesting stuff in the standard challenges in just Orzhov, specifically before we got the kind of Storm Chasers talent loops going with This Town Ain't Big Enough. So this one is reverting back to those roots, playing Braids, playing Temporary Lockdown. One of the really fun things about Temporary Lockdown in a deck like this is it wipes your board as much as it does your opponent, and then you can then bounce it with the Nurturing Pixie to get all of your ETBs off of your Momentum Breakers, your Grim Baubles, your Hopeless Nightmares, etc. So we've seen kind of a Temporary Lockdown build of Orzhov Pixie before, and that's what this is leaning more towards. They both have pros and cons, right? And then the other one is that we can run Liliana the Veil. Harder one to justify in the Esper bounce. Sometimes you see it in Dimir bounce, but not usually. But yeah, just going into kind of attacking your opponent's resources, and then Unholy Annex being like a really busted Phyrexian arena. Oh, and I think I forgot to mention how well this one did. So this was Orzhov Pixie by Callie, and went 30 and 18 for a 63% win rate. All right, and then last but not least is the second version of the mono red goblins, and this one is leaning more towards the Krenko build, which I think is at least the more popular build. We'll see which one becomes the better build over time, right? But this one was mono red goblins by Devil Prophet, went 37 and 20 for a 65% win rate into Mythic, and this one is also not running the Greaser Inch Goblin, dropping the Cavern of Souls, not running the Impact Tremors, only running one copy of Squee, and not running the Draconics Engineer, which is another way that we can kind of give our Krenko haste, and instead is running the Dropkick Bomber like the other list, and running running the 4 Cacophony Scamps like the other list as well, and then running 2 copies of the Volley Veteran, and this one being creature removal, deals damage equal to target creature and opponent controls equal to the number of goblins you control. So a little bit of like a creature, like an interesting inclusion. I'm not sold on it because it is a little bit expensive, and I like to try to keep this deck kind of on the lower end of the curve. But the reason also, I think I forgot to mention, the reason why I keep talking about the Grease Wrench Goblin is because the Grease Wrench Goblin is kind of like a 2-1 for 1, allows you to kind of attack nicely with the Seer Slicer Goblin. But the Burnout Bastronaut is definitely here to stay. This working really well with the Seer Slicer Goblin. And then, like I mentioned, sometimes the Draconautics Engineer is included, especially if you're going to be running the full playset of Krenko. So, oh, and I might have said 3. This is running a full playset. I got thrown off by the alternative art. So, anyway, thanks for listening to my ramblings. I hope it finds you well. As far as changes in the community, and kind of just some things I'd like to do for community announcements, if you will. So this Tuesday, or this following Tuesday, not this one coming up, but the first Tuesday of March, I would like to cover some of your guys' builds. So if you have any brews in Standard that you would like me to look at in Best of 1 or Best of 3, look for that in the look for the Community Deck Tech in the Community tab. I also am trying to up the amount of brewing that I do. So every Thursday, I'm going to start trying to do a brew video, just kind of one in Best of 1. And for those who are YouTube members, you get to vote on which one you would like to see. All of my brews are always available in Moxfield as well. And there's one other thing that I'm forgetting. Oh, I'm also playing around with the idea of switching the Best of 1 decks from talking about these like... So every week I run into this issue, and I've seen this happen with other people who have been doing meta reviews, where a small sample size creates kind of like a weird deck, right? Like you'll get a deck that was like, okay, this was in Mythic, it did at least 200 matches, but it was a 63 card deck and was running 3 additional mountains or whatever, right? And so what I'm going to try to do is lean more towards sample size and away from the smaller stuff and just see how it goes, right? So I'll be talking about the most popular builds in the Best of 1 instead of these kind of little one-offs, right? And then using the meta breakers like this to talk a little bit more about the unique builds that have come out throughout the weeks, right? And we'll see. Maybe there's not enough. The reason why I did it the other way the first time around was because it kind of gave me more to talk about. And if I'm doing the most popular build, it might not move around enough. So it's going to be a little bit of an exploration. We'll see how it goes. So anyway, thanks again. I hope you guys are all enjoying the Pro Tour, competing in your own RCQs and on the ladder, and doing well there. So take care, everybody, and I will see you all tomorrow for the proper Best of 1, Best of 3 meta review.